Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, I'm going to be discussing lionfish expansion in the Caribbean. So, let's go ahead and get started with a little bit of the life history of lionfish in general, just kind of give ourselves a little bit of background info on what we're going into. So, lionfish can be mainly identified by their brown and maroon coloration as well as kind of their different fins and spines, which these with lionfish, they are equipped with 13 dorsal spines, 10 to 11 dorsal rays, three anal spines, and 6 to 7 soft anal rays. So they're very fanned out with a lot of fins, rays, and spines. These fish originate from the South Pacific and Indian Oceans. They do not move very quickly through the water. They move very slowly through the water, and so a lot of the mechanisms on their body, like their fins and their spines, as well as their coloration, are often used depended on and used to discourage predators from trying to eat them. These fish really can be found in all types of warm water environments in the tropics. These fish really kind of dominate in these regions, as well as they are, in terms of their hunting habits, they're nocturnal hunters that look to ambush and really essentially corner their prey by spreading out their fins like a fan and essentially trying to trick the fish into this idea that there's no way out, they're cornered. Now that we have a bit of a better idea of what kind of fish we're dealing with, let's go into some of the reasons why the occurrence of lionfish in the Caribbean can bring cause for concern. So, starting with, well, how did the lionfish get there? A lot of it is a bit of speculation. A lot seem to think that it was a bit of an unintended introduction of lionfish in the Caribbean. They presumed it to be really from the aquarium industry due to the popularity of having this really colorful fish in people's aquariums. It really just kind of boomed for that industry. And so, and also another potential source of how these lionfish got here um, could be from just really various trade routes from very big transport vessels in their ballast tanks collecting up the water in their native region. They could have pulled up some of the eggs of lionfish and transported them to the Caribbean in general. Um, like we talked about earlier with nocturnal hunters and being ambush hunters, a lot of their prey mainly comes while in their youth. They hunt smaller crustaceans, and then once they've matured, they start primarily hunting smaller fish. Um, Really, what causes concern with how they eat, especially in the Caribbean, it comes from their booming population. And these smaller fish, as well as these crustaceans, start getting the concern that their populations going to rapidly decline. And with those rapid declines, you kind of have this bit of this like domino effect on the ecosystem where other parts that were regulated by these smaller fish, such as algae, start to get a little bit more out of control. And this can really lead to, honestly, the death of the ecosystem. In this presentation, I want to provide you with information on kind of what's really going on in the Caribbean and discuss what steps really need to be taken in order for this to balance this ecosystem. So, in terms of my methods, I really focused on primary literature databases and I wanted to focus on two studies. The first study, I want to focus on how lionfish have adapted to this new environment and how really kind of these fish adapt in their normal environment versus how they adapt in the Caribbean and why that gives them such an advantage. The second study wants to focus more on the presence and influence of lionfish. Really, like, what have they done to the ecosystem as a whole? And so we're going to go ahead and go right into this first study. I wanted to go ahead and just kind of give you a baseline of what really they got out of studying lionfish in the Caribbean and what they began to notice. So this study was conducted on how lionfish had developed in their non-native habitat. They focused on really three factors. They focused on age, growth, and overall population. Looking at those factors with lionfish populations in Northeast Florida, they really found four things. One, lionfish grew rapidly in the region. Two, they exhibit a bit of a seasonal growth pattern. And three, during that seasonal growth pattern, they really found that lionfish really peak recruitment was during the early summer. And the last factor was over the average age of lionfish was found to be significantly younger than in their native region, with older populations being virtually absent. All right, and let's go ahead and move to these points. So the first point I want to discuss is rapid population growth. So obviously with these fish, they're going to want to spawn as much as possible just due to how susceptible they can be by outside predators. So usually with these rapid population growths, we see usually a faster period of maturity in these fish unlike other predatory species. So with lionfish as an example, lionfish grow and reach maturity after a year of age. The rapid population growth that we see and with the low maturity, it really makes sense. It's very functional in a sense because obviously you need your species to mature faster. You need your spawn to mature faster in order to maximize the survival of your lineage, basically. Not that they're really worried about lineage, but it helps them gain a bit of an advantage. And like as an example, sea bass, black sea bass, in the region, they have longer and slower growth rates because they're not as worried about the competition as much as lionfish are. And so this gives lionfish a very distinct advantage, and they build it and a very distinct advantage in the Caribbean. All right, so moving to the second point. Second point focuses on these seasonal growth patterns. So overall, when they were really looking at how these lionfish have been able to adapt to these regions, they really were able to find that seasonal growth patterns were very noticeable. The breeding season occurred mainly in the early summer, and this really, in a sense, allowed lionfish mortality to be decreased. Basically it worked as if these fish were able to breed very quickly in the early summer. It will allow them to go during a time where it's just very warm. They would spawn very quickly and be able to branch out very fast during the summer months. A lot of things, as we allude to towards the end, this is where you can really notice a lot more of management decisions really coming into play. But let's go ahead and move on to the third point. The third point was about the peak recruitment being during the early summer. So obviously this works in conjunction with the previous point. Peak recruitment correlated with those seasonal growth patterns. And this was likely from their own adaptation from being in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific to minimize those mortality rates during the winter months. So this allowed them to basically maximize not only their chance of survival for their spawn, but also maximizing the amount of spawn that these fish could produce in their lifetime. All right, and moving to the last point is going to be talking about really the average age of these fish in the Caribbean versus in their own native habitat. Well, this is likely to come from really outside influences such as like humans being influencing, going on dives, and really just kind of killing as many of these fish as they can. Obviously, with their very rapid growth patterns and their just very significant dominance on the region, humans have noticed this and been able to organize, little parties to, hunt as much of these fish as you possibly can. And with the age being so consistent, it's likely due to just older lionfish being easier to kill and catch, unlike the younger ones. Obviously, if it's older and it's moving slower, it's obviously going to be easier to kill versus a lionfish that's giving you a run for its money. Now that we've talked about really kind of these points of how these fish have been able to adapt to this environment, let's go ahead and move on to the second study that I want to emphasize in this presentation over what we can do in terms of what's going on with the ecosystem. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing as I did with my first study and go over kind of just what the scientists really found as they conducted the study. It focused on mainly how the presence and influence of lionfish has affected the overall health of the ecosystem. This study looks at two things. It looks at management actions that humans can really do to mitigate this issue, as well as looking at kind of the worst case scenarios of, okay, if nothing can be stopped, what can happen? And so the two scenarios for the worst case scenarios were either the population will decrease due to starvation, or the population will be managed by native pathogens, parasites, predators. Basically, the ecosystem will balance out. So let's go ahead and start with the management actions. So the first recommendation by the group of scientists that conducted this study was to promote hunting parties for divers to go out and kill and capture as many of these fish as possible. The only drawback that they began to notice was there's not enough people to hunt all these reefs. There's just way too much of an expansive region, as well as these fish really can go down to depths that farther than really people can go safely. Now, in the second recommendation that they suggested is they wanted to enhance biotic resistance. Now, biotic resistance refers to the ecosystem itself, such as top predators, to start aiming at hunting these lionfish as a resource instead of as normal prey in order to maintain the populations. So basically, how they wanted to use biotic resistance to capture these fish is by suggesting fishing restrictions on top predators and marine reserves to and protecting marine reserves to best fix the problem. Now we're going to go into two of the worst case scenarios. The first case scenario, as I previously mentioned, was that lionfish will basically die due to starvation. This is obviously the worst of the worst because that would mean that lionfish have abused and used all the resources of the system to its maximum and can basically mean that the ecosystem is most likely going to collapse. All right. And in the second worst case scenario, um, the focus is on, native species working in combination to mitigate the damage. This point works along with the preferred strategy. So I don't know if there's a little bit of an influence with this worst case scenario, but I think in this situation, there's only so much that human influence can do. So it's very important to understand that while we can have a small effect on it, there is only so much that we can do, and the ecosystem is basically going to have to be able to balance itself out. So, going into conclusion, what I really want you to get from this, lionfish have a lot of advantages, but um, they're also in an invasive environment. First study focuses on how lionfish adapt very quickly. Second focus studies on the health of the ecosystem. Their hunting habits have a detrimental effect on the ecosystem. And then and the native species play an important role in the balancing of this introduction. Uh, Thank you guys so much. These are my references, and I hope you have a great day.